Hello everyone! In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I made a Bridgerton inspired dress using my new pattern, the Mix and Match Regency Dress Pattern. And this pattern can be found in my Etsy shop as a downloadable PDF. Now today I'm going to be making a silver dress which is inspired by something Sophie Beckett might wear. Perhaps a character we will meet in the Bridgerton universe in the future. Now this dress is made with a circle skirt, so please be warned that the circle skirt is perhaps the most challenging skirt type. Because the circle skirt has parts that fall on the bias, it will need extra care and attention when you trim and hem it. But it is definitely the most twirly, beautiful, romantic skirt, so perhaps the extra trouble and extra effort is worth it. I'm very excited to share the process with you, so let's get into it. For materials, I'm going to be using 7 meters of this crinkled silver satin fabric with a wide width of about 140 centimeters. I will also be using a ½ meter of cotton for interlining the bodice, a zipper that is 35 centimeters long, and 2 floral appliques that I'm going to apply to the front of my bodice later on. The first thing I'm going to do is choose and prepare my pattern pieces. First, I need to select the bodice, sleeve, and skirt style. I've decided to use the 2-dart bodice, the fitted sleeve, and circle skirt pattern to create this silver gown. Now my mix and match Regency dress pattern does come with different bodice, sleeve, and skirt styles. That way you can mix and match the pattern pieces to create a unique gown. This pattern includes 3 bodice styles, 6 sleeve styles, and 4 different skirts to choose from. But for this dress, I've decided to use the 2-dart bodice, the fitted sleeve, and the circle skirt. After choosing my pattern pieces, I'm going to print the PDF on the correct paper size, A4 or US letter, and I'm going to make sure my scale is set to 100%. I also like to change my print margins to 0. And here are my 3 PDFs printed and ready to be assembled. The 2-dart bodice PDF, the fitted sleeve PDF, and the circle skirt PDF. First, I like to check the measurement of the square on the first page of each PDF and make sure the dimensions are correct. Then I begin trimming the page margins as needed and taping the pages together to create a grid. Every PDF is going to create its own unique grid. For example, the pattern for my sleeve is only 4 pages across. 4 pages where I trim the margin and tape the pages together to create the pattern. However, the pattern for my 2-dart bodice is 8 pages, and it creates a grid that is 4 pages across and 2 pages tall for the total of 8 pages. And the pattern for my circle skirt is 54 pages. These 54 pages create a grid that is 9 pages across and 6 pages down for the total of 54 pages. The circle skirt is the largest pattern piece in my mix and match Regency dress pattern, and that is because the full circle skirt requires a large pattern piece. So please keep this in mind if you are selecting this pattern. Next, I cut out my pattern to my selected size, which is size 38. The pattern is labeled by the bust size in inches, so take your bust measurement around the fullest part of your bust, your apex, and you can use this measurement to choose your own size. For example, I have a 38-inch bust, so I chose size 38. If you're in between sizes or prefer a tighter fitting bodice, then you can test sizing down with a mock-up, which is exactly what I'm going to do next, make a mock-up. Making a mock-up is super important and I highly recommend it. If anything, please test a mock-up of the bodice pieces before cutting into your expensive dress fabric. Making a mock-up can save you so much heartache, and it's also a great chance for you to fine-tune the fit of your garment. For example, you might wish to lower, raise, or shape the neckline. You may wish to adjust the darts, making them longer, wider, or more narrow, and you can check your center back for your closure of choice. For example, you might want more room if you're using buttons. You can also compare your measurements to the pattern and see if any other adjustments are needed. You can compare your height to the skirt length and decide if you need to lengthen or shorten the skirt. I have decided that I wish to lower the neckline of my bodice. So I have lowered the neckline by about 3 centimeters at the center front, while being mindful of the 1 centimeter required for seam allowance. I created a mock-up and then used a marker to draw the lower neckline, and then I used my ruler to transfer these measurements to my pattern and redraw the new neckline, again making sure to leave 1 centimeter for that seam allowance. And with that, my pattern pieces are all ready, and I can now cut my pattern pieces out from my dress fabric. When cutting out the circle skirt pattern, I'm going to open up my fabric to its full width. Then I'm going to stack my fabric in 4 layers, and each layer is going to be the same length, about 145 centimeters. So I have 4 stacked layers, each about 145 centimeters long. As you can see, one side of the stack will have a folded edge and 2 cut edges, and the other side of the stack has 2 folded edges. Now it's up to you if you want to create a center back seam for your skirt, or if you'd rather make a small slit into the center back so that you can get in and out of the dress. I find that making the center back seam is much easier. It's an easier way to construct the dress, and it's easier when adding the back closure. But if you don't want a center back seam, then you can instead cut a small slit into the center back. If you prefer to have a center back seam, then you will essentially be cutting 1 large half circle shape and 2 quarter circle shapes. If you cut 2 half circles, then you will need to cut one of those half circles in half. Or you can cut the 2 half circle shapes, and into the top edge you're going to cut that small slit, about 10 to 20 centimeters long. This is where that center back seam would have been. You will also want to cut a small piece of binding, about 20 to 40 centimeters long, so that you can finish that cut edge. Then with my remaining fabric, after I have cut out my 2 half circles for the full circle skirt, I'm going to cut out my bodice and sleeve pieces. And while doing this, I want to be very cognizant of the nap of my fabric and make sure all of my pattern pieces are going top to bottom the same way. The same way that the center front of my skirt is, I want that to be the same for my bodice and sleeves. This way the sheen of the satin looks right on all of the pieces, the bodice, skirt, and sleeves. And that was really something only I needed to worry about because of my fabric choice. I've also decided, in addition to lining my bodice, I want my sleeves to be lined. So I cut 2 additional sleeves so that I can line my sleeves. So I have 4 sleeves in total. And after cutting everything out of my satin fabric, I then cut my bodice pieces out of my cotton fabric so that I have a layer for interlining the bodice. So now I want to recap everything I have cut out. I have cut out 2 skirt pieces on the fold. These are shaped like half circles, so I have 2 half circles, which will make the full circle. One of them has a slit cut into the center back, which is about 12 centimeters long. I have also cut a piece of binding that is about 25 centimeters long and 2.5 centimeters wide. I've also cut 2 bodice fronts cut on the fold in satin, one for lining and one for the outer layer. 4 bodice sides in satin, 2 for lining and 2 for the outer layer. 4 bodice backs in satin, 2 for lining and 2 for the outer layer. And I've cut 4 sleeves in satin, 2 for the outside layer and 2 for the lining. And I've also cut 1 bodice front cut on the fold in plain white cotton for interlining, 2 bodice sides in plain white cotton for interlining, and 2 bodice backs in plain white cotton for interlining. So now that everything's been cut out, I am ready to add the interlining to the bodice outer layer pieces and then put the darts into my bodice. Now I like to use my bodice pattern piece like a stencil and draw the darts in on the cotton interlining and lining pieces. Now I am being quite naughty and I'm using pen to draw my darts, but I recommend you use chalk or a fabric pen to draw your own darts. After the darts have been drawn onto my interlining and lining pieces, I then attach the interlining to the back of my bodice pieces. So basically, I'm going to pin the cotton pieces to the wrong side of my bodice front, side, and back pieces. Now, adding a layer of cotton to the bodice as interlining is totally optional, but I highly recommend it. The cotton can help prevent warping around the neckline and other cut curved edges. It can also give the bodice and darts a bit of structure and shape, and it can help support heavy skirts and other embellishments you might add. I find the layer of cotton especially beneficial when working with slippery or lightweight fabrics like this poly satin. So I just put the cotton layer on the back of my bodice pieces and then I pin them together. And then I can treat these two fabrics as one. I also highly recommend basting the two layers together and then you can begin sewing. Basting the outer layer to the cotton interlining layer will prevent any shifting that could happen when you're sewing, and it's going to make treating the two layers as one layer a lot easier. I also decided to baste my darts into my bodice before machine stitching. I matched the legs of the darts together and then pinned the darts in place, and then I basted by hand the darts, securing them. And this was just another way to prevent any shifting that could happen when I machine stitch my darts. And after I basted my darts into my bodice, I went around all of the edges and basted the two layers together for the bodice front, the bodice side, and the bodice back. Now, all of this basting can be quite tedious and time consuming, but I think it is very well worth it and will help you create a nice, tidy, finished look to your garment. Basting the outer layer of the bodice to the interlining layers will help prevent any shifting that could happen when you're sewing on the machine. And basting the darts before machine stitching is another great way to make sure you like the darts, that they are sat correctly before you machine stitch them. And once all of your basting has been finished, you can then go to the machine and start machine stitching. And here you can see what all of my pieces look like once they have been basted together and the darts have been basted into the front of the bodice. After basting everything, I use my machine to sew the darts into the front of my bodice, starting at the bottom of the dart and stitching upwards, tapering off the bodice as I sew. I then tie the thread end to secure it, and I repeat this for the other darts on my bodice. Next, I match my bodice side to my bodice front along the straight side edges with right sides facing one another, and I pin. Then I stitch using 1 centimeter of seam allowance, and I stitch first with a straight stitch, then I trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And I repeat this for the other side seam of my bodice. Next, I attach my bodice back to my bodice side, matching the curved edges together with right sides facing one another, and then I pin. After pinning, I stitch with 1 centimeter of seam allowance and then trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Now, when pinning and sewing these curved edges together, work slowly. These can be very tricky to match together, so sometimes they need a little extra time and fussing. After sewing my bodice back to my bodice side, I like to give the bodice a good press with an iron, and I like to press all of my seams and darts towards the back. Next, I match the shoulder strap edges together with right sides facing one another, and I pin the bodice front to the bodice back at that top shoulder edge, and then I stitch. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and finish it with a zigzag stitch. And then I repeat all of these previous steps to create my bodice lining. Stitch the darts in place, stitch the bodice front to the bodice side, stitch the bodice side to the bodice back, and then stitch the top shoulder edges of the bodice front to the bodice back together. And now you should have one complete bodice for the outside layer and one for the lining. You can also see the subtle difference that adding the cotton interlining layer makes. So now that both bodices are ready, we can set them aside and start making the sleeves. Now for these fitted sleeves, I'm going to finish them with a lining, but you could instead choose to finish them with binding or a simple hem. First, I'm going to join the lining to the outer layer by sewing the bottom edges together. Then I'm going to fold the sleeve in half and stitch the side to create a tube, sewing down the side of both the outer and lining layers. Then I'm going to turn the sleeve right side out and match the top edges together and baste them. This is basically how I'm going to create a lined sleeve. So first I match the sleeve outer layer to the lining with right sides together and I pin the bottom edges together. I will have my sleeve outer layer facing the lining with the bottom edges matched and pinned together. Next, I stitch the bottom edges together and then I open it up and press the seam allowance towards the lining, and then I'm going to understitch that seam allowance to the lining. Then I'm going to fold the sleeve in half and match the sides together, taking care to match the key points like the bottom seam and top corners. I pin the sides together and then I stitch, pivoting slightly at that bottom seam. Now I can turn my sleeve right side out, and I'm going to press the bottom and the side seams with an iron. Pressing that side seam open is going to help make that sleeve sit more smooth and flush against itself, and pressing that bottom edge will also create a nice tidy look. Now I'm going to very carefully match the top edges of my sleeve head together and pin. I want to match the top edge of my sleeve lining to the outer layer and make sure that they are sitting smooth and flat against one another. I don't want there to be any twisting or bubbling. I pin these top edges together and then baste them by hand so that these top edges are secure to one another, and I can now treat it as one layer. You can also choose to add a gathering line of stitches to the sleeve head. This will make easing the sleeve into the armhole later on much easier. I didn't add any gathering line of stitches, but you could to make it easier in the future. Simply use the straight stitch on the longest length on your machine and add a gathering line of stitches to the sleeve head. And this is how my sleeves look once completed. Next, I'm going to set the sleeve into the bodice with the right side of my sleeve facing the right side of my bodice, right sides together. I'm going to start by matching the side seam of my bodice to the side seam of my sleeve and pinning these points together. And then working up either side of the armhole, I'm going to pin the sleeve flat and smooth into the armhole of the bodice, matching and pinning as I work up either side of the armhole. Again, starting at that side seam and working my way upwards towards the top shoulder area. Now from where that top shoulder strap seam is to over top the shoulder is where I'm going to be wanting to focus my gathers. And this is where I'm going to gather down the remaining volume of that sleeve head. I just created a few small gathers by hand and then pinned them into place, pinning the entire sleeve into the armhole with just a small amount of gathers focused at that top shoulder area. You may find it easier to add a gathering line of stitches to the sleeve head and then pull on those threads to gather down the sleeve so that it fits into the armhole, sort of easing it into place. And you're going to want to repeat this for the other sleeve. Again, starting by matching the side seam of the bodice to the side seam of the sleeve with right sides touching. Pinning up either side of the armhole, keeping the sleeve smooth and flushed and set into the bodice. At the top shoulder area, gather down the remaining volume of the sleeve head so that it fits into the armhole and pin it in place. Then the entire sleeve should be pinned into the bodice, and the lower armpit area is set smoothly into the armhole, and the top shoulder area is where all of the gathers are focused. I like to keep my gathers in about a 10 to 12 centimeter range, starting at that bodice's shoulder seam and going forwards. And I use a ruler to make sure both sleeves and gathers are symmetrical. Next, I stitch the sleeve into the armhole of my bodice. And as I stitch, I take care when sewing over top the gathers, and I stitch around the entire armhole, securing the sleeve. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and then finish it with a zigzag stitch. And I repeat this for the other sleeve. And here's how the bodice looks with the sleeves added to it. Next, I'm going to work on the skirt for my dress. Here you can see the two half circle shapes for my skirt. One of the half circles has a 12 centimeter slit cut into the center back. The first thing I'm going to do is finish this cut edge with a bit of binding. I stitch the binding to the cut edge, the right side of the binding facing the wrong side of the skirt. I'm going to sew with a fairly narrow seam allowance to keep the bound edge tiny and tidy. And then I fold the binding over to the right side of the skirt. And then I fold the binding's raw edges inwards 2 times. This will completely hide the raw edges of my binding, and I place the folded edge just over top my previous line of stitching, covering it just a little bit, and then I top stitch it down in place. Now you could finish this cut edge with bias tape instead, or opt for a center back seam, which I think is an easier method altogether. If you decide to have a center back seam, then you can wait to sew it up until after you've added your back closure. And here's how it looks with the binding added to that cut edge. This is what I have chosen to do instead of having a center back seam. Next, I match my skirt front to my skirt back with right sides together, and I pin the side edges. I like to start pinning at the top and work my way downwards, matching the sides together and pinning. You can also see I have added a safety pin to mark the center front of my skirt. After pinning, I am going to sew up the sides of my skirt. First, I stitch with a straight stitch, then I trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch, and I repeat this for the other side seam. You of course could choose to have a French seam instead, so that the raw edge is completely hidden. So now my skirt is kind of like a big tube with all of the sides sewn together, and it is ready to be attached to the bodice. I'm going to match the top waist edge of my skirt to the bottom waist edge of my bodice, and I'm going to match these waist edges together with right sides touching. I will start by finding the center front of my skirt and the center front of my bodice and match these 2 points together and pin. Working down either side of the dress towards the back, I'm going to continue matching the skirt to the bodice and pinning these edges together, keeping everything smooth and flush. Again, starting at the center front and working towards the back of my dress. Once I reach the back of the dress, I'm going to gather or pleat down the remaining waist edge of the skirt so that it can fit onto the back of the bodice. Basically, the skirt's waist edge is much longer than the bodice's waist edge, so that remaining length must be pleated or gathered down so that it can fit. It's up to you if you prefer pleats or gathers at the back of your dress. There is flexibility in how you arrange the back of your dress, and much of this will be up to your taste and preference. I think creating the gathers may be easier. You can just add a gathering line of stitches to the back and then gather it down to fit. However, I really like the look of the pleats, so I chose to create pleats for this silver dress. I'm also going to leave a little room for seam allowance at my bodice's center back edge for when I add my lining. For this dress, I'm going to create 3 pleats on each side, focusing the pleats at the back of the dress, and then I pinned them in place. And this part can take a little fussing. I often repleat 2 or 3 times before I am satisfied. Once my skirt has been pinned to my bodice all along the waist edge and I am satisfied with the pleats and their placement, I can then take it to the machine and sew that waist seam. Sewing the skirt to the bodice, I stitch, trim the seam allowance, and then finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Here is how the dress looks so far. I've left 1 centimeter of seam allowance on the bodice's center back edge because I'm going to be sewing my lining there. My skirt's center back edge is already finished with the binding, so it's not necessary. I did keep this in mind when I was placing the pleats on the back of my dress. Now I add my lining to my bodice, matching the 2 bodices starting at their center front points with right sides together. And I pin these center front points together and then match and pin all the other key points together, like the center back edges and shoulder seams. And I pin the lining to the bodice all around the neckline and the center back edge. Next, I'm going to stitch my lining to my bodice, sewing around the entire neckline and the center back edges. After sewing my lining to the bodice, I clip the seam allowance and trim the corners to make turning right side out easier. As I clip, I take care not to cut through my line of stitching. Then I can turn the bodice right side out and press the neckline and the center back edges with an iron to get everything crisp and looking tidy. Next, I'm going to fold the seam allowance of my lining inwards and pin it down. I pin along the waistline on the inside of my dress as well as the armholes. Then I can stitch by hand the lining to the seam allowance of my bodice. By turning the edges of my lining inwards and hand sewing it to the seam allowance of my bodice's outer layer, I can create a tidy, finished inside to my dress. And while this can be a bit time-consuming, it is very well worth it, I think. I like that it creates such a nice finished inside to the garment. Again, I'm just going to hand sew the lining to the seam allowance of my dress, sewing all around the waist and the armholes. I've also decided that I want to pin my zipper into the back of my dress and stitch it in place by hand. I think because my dress does not have a typical center back seam, I wanted to sew my zipper in by hand so that I had more control over it. You of course could opt to sew the zipper in place before adding your lining. This will create a much prettier finished look with the zipper partially hidden under the lining. You could also choose to just machine stitch the zipper in place instead of hand sewing it like I am. You could also just go for a totally different back closure, like adding buttons, hooks and eyes, ribbon ties, or eyelets for a corset style back. This is totally up to you. But please, I recommend you test this out with a mock-up. Now, from the inside of the dress, I think the zipper looks just okay, but from the outside, I think the center back of my dress does look very nice. So anyways, I sew my zipper by hand into the back of my dress, and I continue sewing my lining to my bodice's seam allowance. And now the last thing to do is tackle this monster hem. The circle skirt has the fullest hem, and while it is very pretty and twirly, it can be quite challenging to trim and hem. First, I like to hang my dress for 1 to 2 days. This is because parts of the circle skirt fall on the bias, and with time and gravity, those parts will stretch out. So I'd like to hang my dress and allow the circle skirt time to stretch. Then I can trim it to my desired length. You may find that the center front, sides, and center back parts are the shortest, as these parts are going to be on the straight and cross grain, so there's going to be a minimum of stretching. Sometimes I use these parts as a guide to help me determine the length of the rest of the skirt. A guide sort of like when you're cutting hair. I also like to use my measuring tape and let it hang down from the under bust seam to determine the length. And then I use pins to mark my desired length, and then I go around the entire circumference of it, trimming it to my desired length. After my first initial trim, I like to tidy it up a bit more, but please be careful not to get carried away and trim away too much and make it much too short. And since the zipper and the lining have already been added and completed, you can try on your dress multiple times to check the length. Once I'm happy with the length, I like to finish the bottom edge with a narrow rolled hem. First, I fold up the raw edge and stitch it down. Then I trim the seam allowance if needed to keep it very narrow. I fold the edge up one more time and stitch it down again to completely hide the raw edge. And then I finish with a nice press with the iron. Again, this hem is going to be very time consuming. There is a lot of length to sew, but it does create a very twirly skirt with lots of drama. And now my dress is finished, but I felt that it needed a little something to give it a little interest and pizzazz. So I decided I was going to add these two silver appliques to the front of the bodice for a little more glamorous detail. I took my time getting them even and symmetrical, using pins to help me place them, and then I used a little fabric glue and some hand stitching to secure them in place to the front of the dress. And with that, my dress was finished, and now I'm very excited to share it with you. thank you for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see other fun DIY videos or other videos where I make more Bridgerton inspired dresses, then definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.